How's it going, friends, and welcome to the channel. So in this video we are going to be looking at Italari's 1/24th Iveco Turbostar truck. Now I fancied doing, I'd say, something slightly different. It's not that different because obviously it's an abandoned truck, or something that's just abandoned, which is quite common here, but I wanted to do a bit of graffiti. So I saw this lorry when I was at the Key Model World model show, and I thought that'd be a perfect subject to be able to try and do some graffiti. Now, my freehand isn't particularly brilliant, but we'll see how this one turns out, shall we? So grab yourself a brew and a bicky, and we'll jump straight into it. So like all good vehicles, we want to start with the chassis. Now, clearly they have made this chassis very universal for different types of lorries. Obviously this one's for a short base, so we do need to do a bit of surgery to lengthen it. As you can see on the back there was a cut line. I've scored around the front so I can get a better, what I feel will be a better cut from the top down rather than going the other way. Don't know why, but that's what I did. So just cutting that section in half, and then all we need to do is splice a new piece in. I've used a ruler to make sure that this part is still nice and straight, and then what I would have done is filled and sand the gaps in. Later on there's a section that needs to be done off the back. I wish I'd filled and sanded in. It's slightly a little bit obvious, but fortunately the box section covers most of it. But yeah, should have done that. When adding the bracings and the axles, make sure that the frame is pretty much sort of straight and true. Mine is a little bit wonky, but fortunately the box section on the back actually straightens that out a little bit. The front axle is probably the more, I must say, complicated, but it's the sort of more involved because you can actually have this posable. Later on when I finish the model, I'll actually glue this into place because I just didn't want it swinging around all over the place. Plus I don't have to keep positioning it every time I move the model. Now there is more detail to the engine block than what is here. I haven't bothered putting it in, mainly because I'm not going to have the cab open and closable. Also I want to use those for another project at some point in the future. But when putting this in, I'd also put in one of the axles in at the same time. You'll see in a bit there's a little part in the middle that joins the two axles, and mine are quite loose in the end. Fortunately the engine sort of didn't stick very well, so I was able to reposition that later on. In this part you can see me putting the swing arm, which makes the axle posable. They suggest with a lot of these parts to keep them movable by using a hot screwdriver and pushing the plastic down, which means that it will obviously make a little dome over the top, which makes it movable. There's only a few small greeblies that need to be added to the frame, one of which obviously including the fuel tank. Now this was generally quite a nice fit, but as you can see here there was a bit of gappage around the sides. So to make this clean up nice and neat, to use some Vallejo putty, just push this into the gap, and then later with the cotton bud just run around that will push it all into the sides. And if there's a little bit of overspill and a little bit of mess after that, just use slightly moistened cotton bud to clean all that up. Sometimes you do find that it may pull some of it back up with it, and then all you need to do is let it dry and then do the same process over again. Now the box section I'm not going to show in its entirety because it's too flaming big, but we've got a couple of the sides are fine because they're nice big sections. The front section is in two halves. Now this isn't too bad because you'll have the cooling unit on the front. Then also the cab will also cover most of it. Now the way I've done mine, you probably will see some of this maybe, but generally you won't see it if you do it the way it's supposed to be built. So this seam in particular, don't have to worry about too much. The roof section on the other hand, massively frustrating. So very much the same as the front piece. You've got two sections that slide together, which again I said is frustrating because the two side pieces are singular. So why they couldn't do it for the roof, no idea. There is a couple of sort of sink marks down the middle. I'm trying to show it there, but it's very difficult to see. So not only did I have to fill the seam, but also to try and smooth the top off a lot. Unfortunately, I think in the end result you can sort of still see some of that seam there, as much as I try to get rid of it. The interior itself is actually quite nice. Not much of it, but nicely detailed nonetheless. As you can see, there's a few gaps in here. There are what probably potentially in some other versions of this, these were windows. On the side they're vents. So what I've done with all these, I've just added a bit of plastic card on the back of there just to blank these off, because I'm not sure if you would be able to see through. Very later on in the stage I'll paint these black so you won't see it at all. Not that it really mattered, but to blend all this in, I decided to use the same as sort of armour cast texturing. So I thinned out some putty using some Tamiya extra thin and smooshed it in there, covering up all the seams and the gaps that I had, and then just stippled it to give it the same texture as the rest of it. This won't be seen at all, particularly from the way I'm doing this, as opposed to it being done properly in a clear window. You probably will, well, you will see this. So these are quite a good idea to fill these in anyway, regardless of whichever way you decide to finish the model. As you can see them fitted here, they are very large pieces, so again, like I said, it's well worth fitting these in. So for the seats, they are very simple pieces to put together. There's a two-part piece at the bottom of the seat itself and the backrest, and the headrest itself is a part that sticks obviously on top of the seat. Now I thought I'd just make it a little bit more interesting by having the headrests raised rather than sitting flush. Whether they do or not, I'm not very sure, but I thought it would be a little bit more interesting. So I've just used a couple of short pieces of wire. So you see I've hooked them over at the back, glued them into place, drilled a couple of small holes in the top of the headrest and slid it on. There you go. Nice little simple add to the model just to make it that little bit more interesting. I don't know if these do that, but I just thought it'd be a bit different. So when it comes to the cab colour, it is very lacklustre, black and grey. So all I've done is painted it black and grey because that's kind of the colour it was. So the only interesting thing I can do is add a bit of dust. All this was a simple sand and buff mix of paint, very heavily thinned down with literally just water, and slopped it all over the interior. And with this, the thinner it is, the better, because there was no form of varnishing on this. So the thinner it is, the less likely it's going to sort of really stick to places that you don't want it to. And it also allows you enough time to adjust any areas that have got too much or pulled sections of paint. I did forget the one singular decal that had to go in the cab, which is obviously the instruments dials. I don't know why I bothered, because you're not going to see it, but I put it in anyway and then gave that a wash as well. After doing some dry fitting and make sure everything was sitting at least roughly in place before gluing it all together, I glued it together, because of course that's the next step. Once the next step was done, I then masked off all the windows. So for that, I just basically completely covered the windscreen and the side windows with masking tape. As you can see me scoring in the tape around the edges of the windows, and with the sharpest of sharp blades I then cut around the window frame. The only sort of problem I had around here actually was the front windscreen. I obviously hadn't glued it properly in its frame and the sides before putting the roof on, so just make sure that that's glued nicely in place beforehand, because I was extremely worried about pushing it in, particularly it went in at one point, so just make sure it's glued when you come to masking it, so you don't push the window into the model, because trying to get that out and glue back into place probably isn't going to be fun. After giving everything a very simple base colour, I then moved on to something a little bit more fun, and something that was actually very much out of my wheelhouse, which was basically freehand painting. Now, I've never been particularly good at drawing or anything like that. I used to be better when I was a kid, when I had a bit more imagination. These days that seems to have disappeared. I don't know whether that's age or just some of the brain numbing jobs I've had in the past. So to help me out, I went through the internet just to try and find some rough ideas. This little grenade here, as well as a couple of others that you'll see later on, I have pretty much directly copied because I just didn't have the imagination for it. Now we'll come back to the graffiti in just a moment because I'm doing this in a bit of a multi-layer. So what I wanted to do is just have a few pieces of graffiti, weather it, and then put another layer over the top of that, just to give it a bit more of a sort of aged look, if you like. Because normally you will see graffiti which is over other graffiti, which is over other graffiti, which is what I was trying to go for. It was also going to give me a bit of a chance to have a bit of a play around doing the freehand before covering it with hopefully something a bit better. So as you can see, what I've been doing, what I've been rambling, is basically what I would normally do for oil streaks. So I've used a kind of a blacky brown, it's more heavy on the black side, and basically just dumped a little blob at the top and just simple streaking motion to bring it down for the impression of the fact that it's been out for a long time and has been in a lot of rain. There was quite a bit of back and forth with this because it'd been a larger scale, me trying to get my head around that and scale up this sort of thing to make it look right. In the end I was very happy with this, and there'll be some more layers to this a little bit later on. Also, what will help with this, because again this is using oils, having a semi or satin gloss finish over this will help you a lot. If you try and do this over a matte, it's going to be a bit of a pain in the backside. So back to the graffiti. Now I did a mix of airbrushing and using AK paint markers, which Mr. Squidward on the left there is which I did before putting a gloss varnish on, and for some reason the paint ran, which actually helped. So I just used my airbrush to spray, not even did spray, just use some air to push the drops down, which made it look like it potentially rained not long after it had been graffitied. I also used the same markers to do little name graffitis and little bits and bobs, just very simple things, just to add a few more layers to this. Now this is the only one I actually masked out. Unfortunately, it left a bit of a step in it because obviously I'd done about 3 or 4 layers of paint, and of course it made a step because it does if you're using a lot of paint when you're masking something. Obviously normally you want to do like passes, but because the graffiti behind it kept on showing through, and I want this one as more of a solid paint job. So this one was masked out using some sheets of vinyl mask, and literally I just sketched this out and cut it out, placed it down. Obviously a lot of the lettering wasn't obviously stenciled out, so everything else, as you can see now, going around the edges and painting it all in and bringing out all the letters. I also know, before anyone says it, I've spelt it wrong, but this graffiti artist, which in this case is actually me, he's dyslexic, so it's special. Just a little bit like me. The hardest thing I actually found doing this was actually the fact that I had to work from the back forwards. It just didn't feel quite natural to me. Probably wouldn't to most people, to be honest with you. But yeah, this was the way I could find it to work, and I assume this is probably how graffiti artists normally do it. I know I've seen videos of it, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, it was interesting. It was a lot of fun, and as these two ones particularly, which would be the main ones that you'll see on we'll call it the front of the model, I'm very pleased with. They turned out quite nicely. With the one that says Dig, that was literally all just airbrushed. I used my Gallery Aventus for, and Dirty I used using the Gallery GHAD39. Now I actually used that with a 0.3 needle, which was a little bit large, but had a 6-holed crown on it, which centered or narrowed the spray down a little bit, which made it a little bit easier. And I also painted all this using Gallery's new Turbox Mini, which I've just recently done a review for. If you want to see that, there's a video in the link in the description. Sorry, there's also other links to discounts and affiliate links, which obviously is no extra cost to you, but obviously gives me a little bit of kickback. So of course, if you want to check those out, there are links in the description down below. So once I'd done those and did a few more scribbles, particularly around the cab, just adds the little ones that obviously the inexperienced typed graffiti artists just sort of tagging the vehicle were added on, again just adding that little extra layer of graffiti. And then I could add the final layer of weathering, which was moss. Now you've seen just beforehand the oils that was using, and again as always at the moment using Winsor & Newton oils. I use a mix of sap green and lemon yellow hue, and in some cases I added a little bit of raw umber to darken it slightly so I could have a few different of variation of moss. For the most part I have used a sponge for this. Now the main reason I've used this is as we stipple, as it sort of dries, it gives a little bit of a texture rather than a kind of a flat finish. And then in other cases I used a brush, again very heavily thinned down. Though for the thinners I'm using universal weathering cover here. Thin down, this will run across stuff like the sills, like at the top. And then what I did with this, with another dry brush, I swiped it up and down again to carry on with the basically the look that the rain has pulled down. I mean, I'm saying it's moss, it's probably more of algae than it is a moss. Either way, it's given us the impression that this thing's been outside for a considerable amount of time. So for the wheel rims, I chipped them by using the sponge chipping technique, very much the same as I was using just for the algae. And I used a dark blacky grey colour mixed in with a dark brown, which I find is a nice basis for rust. Then using some Abteilung light rust, I dabbed a few spots on, then again using the universal weathering camera from VMS to effectively smush it out, basically thin it out, run it around a few areas, particularly stuff around the bolts and kind of like within the rim, just to give an impression of, again, newer, fresher, drippy rust. Once dry, I think sells that notion perfectly of a old rusty wheel rim. Wheel rim. Now the more challenging part was to make the tyres look flat. Now these, as you can see, are vinyl, I think vinyl rubber tyres. So what I found was to cut basically the central tread, leaving the outer walls as they are. Cut the central tread out, which will give us some room to basically melt the outer rim of the tyre and flatten it out. Again, for this part, using a brand new sharp blade, but obviously be very careful you don't cut yourself, because I nearly slipped a few times with this. Now, there's a couple of ways you can flatten them. Obviously, the main thing you need is some heat. Now, I've probably used the most extreme thing I could use to heat them up with, but basically heat them up, try not to let them catch fire if you can, and push them down onto something that's solid and that it's not going to stick to, so something like a tile or something like that. Alternatively, which I did in testing, was I used a flat pair of pliers. I can't do worse today. Flat pliers to obviously force them down. It's a bit of a thing you need to test out. Now this technically had a spare wheels, which I made a right mess of trying this out before I come to it. Now at the ends, when I put these wheels on, I will have to shave a little bit off the bottom so they sit flat. But this is one of the best ways I've found to do it. But maybe use something like a candle or a lighter. That's not as dangerous as that little flamethrower I had. Also, I found before painting, if you give it a quick lick around with the lighter, it will take the sheen off it and it will make it a lot easier for painting. And it takes that sheen off, which gives us a kind of a primer type layer. So there we go, friends. It's nearly time to show you the finished build. I've quite enjoyed this one. I think I've actually done quite well, considering that says my freehand isn't overly brilliant, but I suppose graffiti, you don't have to be perfect. But I did sort of push a little bit for some actual good work on this one, so some of it's okay, some of it's a bit rough, but that's, I suppose, is graffiti art in some ways. But yeah, I was very chuffed with it. The kit was quite nice to do. It's one of the best Italeri ones I've done for a while. Generally went together quite well. I think some of the mistakes of it sitting not right, which I don't think I've mentioned in the video, but most was more my mistake, particularly when I said about the chassis. Need to make sure that is quite straight and true, because I did have to do a bit of jiggery pokery to get that the boxing on the back. So before I leave you with the finished photos, I want to say a massive thank you to you guys for watching. Do hope you have enjoyed. Also a massive shout out to channel members. Again, for you guys, thank you ever so much for supporting financially. If you would like to help support in that way, there are links in the description down below with Buy Me a Ko-fi, one-off payment, like a donation payment, or becoming a channel member. That's all in the description down below. If not, please liking, subscribing, all the good stuff, all the old school stuff still also helps the channel grow. So again, thank you ever so much for that. So until next time, I hope you enjoy the finished photos, and I'll catch you soon.